High above the metropolis, the Sterling penthouse hosted 300 elites. It was a flawless evening, precision engineered to project absolute power and unyielding wealth. Eleanor Sterling stood near the floor-to-ceiling glass, her blonde hair catching the cold chandelier light. She was an anchor of calm in a room designed for quiet scrutiny. Waiters moved like ghosts, offering crystal flutes of champagne. The ambient murmur of the room masked a silent, collective anticipation. Beside Eleanor, an empty chair sat at the main table. Ryan Vance had not arrived. In this circle, absence was never just a delay, it was a statement. Richard Sterling worked the room. At 60, his presence demanded immediate defiance. His bespoke suit and silver hair projected the authority of a financial monarch. He did not raise his voice. He leaned in, speaking to a group of board members. His words were precise, calculated to dismantle without leaving a trace. He described his son-in-law not with anger, but with the measured disappointment of a man assessing a failed asset. A poorly calculated investment, he called him. Eleanor watched her father from a distance. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. She had been trained since childhood never to show the bleeding. A guest approached her, offering a practiced smile and a subtle, probing question about Ryan. Eleanor answered with polite, chilling brevity. The social machinery of the gala ground forward. Every clink of glass and hollow laugh tightened the invisible net Richard was casting across the ballroom. The narrative Richard had seeded was taking root. It moved from cluster to cluster, an invisible contagion of judgment wrapped in the guise of genuine concern. Wealth isolated people, but it also united them against anomalies. Ryan Vance, with his obscure background, was an anomaly the room was eager to correct. Eleanor felt the shift in atmospheric pressure. The glances thrown her way were no longer merely curious, they carried the weight of impending consensus. Through the parting crowd walked Patricia. Decades of maneuvering within the city's upper echelon had sharpened her into something elegant but highly lethal. Patricia placed a perfectly manicured hand on Eleanor's arm. Her smile was warm, a masterful piece of social architecture designed to disarm. She spoke softly, suggesting that sometimes, structural corrections in one's personal life were necessary to preserve the foundation of the future. Eleanor did not flinch. She thanked Patricia with a voice as smooth and impenetrable as the glass windows reflecting the city lights. But Patricia's concern was a calculated distraction. While maintaining eye contact with Eleanor, her other hand briefly illuminated the screen of her phone. A single line of text appeared on the device, hidden from Eleanor's view. It confirmed that the hostile reallocation of Richard's assets was in motion. Unaware of the true trap, Richard continued his performance across the room, confident that he was the only architect of tonight's ruin. Richard seamlessly transitioned to a group of principal investors. His charm was a well-oiled machine, operating with absolute precision and zero hesitation. He spoke in metaphors of long-term vision and the unfortunate necessity of liquidating underperforming assets. Everyone knew he was talking about Ryan. The investors nodded in unison. In this ecosystem, agreeing with Richard Sterling was not just polite, it was a required mechanism for survival. Across the room, Eleanor stood beside a massive, minimalist metal sculpture. The cold, sharp edges of the art perfectly mirrored her environment. A waiter silently offered a fresh flute of champagne. Eleanor declined with a microscopic shake of her head, her focus entirely internal. Yet, not every guest was absorbed into Richard's gravity. Near the terrace doors stood Douglas, a veteran developer with weathered features. Douglas watched Richard hold court. Having built his empire from dirt, he possessed a finely tuned detector for manufactured narratives and hollow consensus. Patricia glided past Douglas, her phone now concealed within her designer clutch. The digital trigger had been pulled, she only needed to wait. The physical distance between Richard at the center and Eleanor at the periphery illustrated the widening fracture within the Sterling legacy. High above the main hall, a minimalist digital clock pulsed silently. Time was running out, and the empty chair beside Eleanor remained unclaimed. The gentle, deliberate chime of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the ambient noise. Instantly, the sprawling room fell into a practiced silence. Richard Sterling approached the sleek, transparent glass podium at the center of the hall. The spotlight caught him perfectly, framing him as the undisputed architect of the evening. Eleanor's posture tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. She knew the mechanics of her father's speeches; they were never merely ceremonial. He began with a grand reflection on the Sterling legacy. He spoke of unyielding standards, of the rigid frameworks required to maintain a multi-generational empire. 300 wealthy faces looked up at him, a sea of absolute compliance. They fed on his certainty, eager to align themselves with power. By the terrace, Douglas remained leaning against the marble pillar. He recognized the overture for what it was, the laying of a foundation for a public execution. Richard's tone shifted subtly, dipping into a register of calculated sorrow. He noted that preserving greatness often demanded the painful excision of misaligned elements. Eleanor's knuckles widened around the clasp of her evening bag. It was the only physical evidence of the immense gravitational pressure compressing her. Deep in the crowd, Patricia maintained an expression of rapt, sympathetic attention. Her mask was flawless, hiding the ticking bomb she had just activated. Across the silent, glittering expanse of the ballroom, Richard's cold eyes finally locked onto Eleanor. The silent ultimatum hung heavy in the chilled air. Richard stepped away from the glass podium. Leaving the microphone behind signaled the end of the formal address and the beginning of a targeted dismantling. He moved across the marble floor with unhurried, predatory grace. The wealthy crowd instinctively parted, creating a white, flawless corridor leading directly to his daughter. The nature of the silence in the room shifted. It evolved from polite, respectful attention into the morbid, breathless curiosity of high society spectators. He stopped 3 feet away from Eleanor. He did not raise his voice, yet his resonant baritone carried with devastating clarity to the edges of the room. He spoke of Ryan Vance. He stripped away the concept of a husband, reducing the absent man to a strategic deficit, an individual completely devoid of structural capital. Eleanor absorbed the clinical assessment without breaking eye contact. Her chest rose and fell in slow, perfectly regulated breaths. The surrounding elites watched intently. For them, this was not a family tragedy, it was a live masterclass in aggressive asset reallocation. Richard declared that the Sterling legacy demanded uncompromising partnerships. It could not sustain the dead weight of a calculated, parasitic investment. He delivered the final term of the ultimatum: correct this profound error tonight, or the lines of succession would be permanently and immediately restructured. The heavy, suffocating weight of the empire pressed down on Eleanor. The entire ballroom froze, waiting for the heiress to either fold or fight. Eleanor finally broke the silence. Her voice did not tremble, it was as level and precisely calibrated as her father's. She stated, with absolute clarity, that Ryan Vance had never requested a position within the Sterling architecture. She explained that her husband operated on a metric of integrity, a currency entirely foreign to the people in this room. In the crowd, Patricia's eyes narrowed with hidden satisfaction. Eleanor's defiance was the perfect catalyst for the impending corporate coup. A microscopic tightening of Richard's jaw betrayed his composed exterior. It was a rare fracture in his armor of absolute control. Eleanor looked directly into her father's eyes and formally refused the ultimatum. She would not liquidate her marriage for his corporate theater. A low, synchronized murmur rippled through the gathered elites. The heirs of the city were witnessing an unprecedented act of rebellion. Richard's expression hardened into pure frost. He warned her, quietly, that she was choosing structural exile over a guaranteed legacy. Eleanor stood her ground, entirely isolated in a sea of tailored suits and evening gowns, unyielding to the gravitational pull of wealth. Across the room, the heavy, mahogany double doors remained firmly closed. The empty chair at the main table still mocked Richard's illusion of total control. The execution was silent. Richard simply turned his back on his daughter, a physical severing of the bloodline recognized by everyone present. With a microscopic nod, he summoned his lead corporate counsel. The legal restructuring of the Sterling Empire would not wait for morning. Eleanor did not crumble. She turned with effortless grace and walked toward the towering glass walls overlooking the city. The social recalibration was instantaneous. The wealthy guests physically distanced themselves from Eleanor, treating her as a newly classified toxic asset. Watching from the periphery, Patricia tapped a final encrypted command into her device: "The king is blind." "Proceed." Douglas took a slow sip of his whiskey. He recognized the fatal arrogance of a man who valued architectural dominance over foundation. Ghost-like waiters seamlessly resumed circulating. The machinery of the gala re-engaged, desperate to pave over the familial rupture with champagne and string music. Richard re-entered the crowd, performing the chilling illusion that the erasure of his only child was merely a routine boardroom adjustment. Eleanor stared at her own faint reflection in the cold glass. Her serenity was unbroken, anchored by a truth the room was completely ignorant of. Below her, the glittering metropolis sprawled like a vast circuit board. The golden cage was fully locked, but the true architect of the evening had not yet arrived. The second hour of the gala commenced. The lively string music provided a flawless, upbeat soundtrack to the brutal corporate execution occurring in the margins. In a quiet, shadowed alcove, Richard's lead counsel rapidly inputted data into a secure tablet, drafting the preliminary terms of disinheritance. Richard approached the alcove. The cold, blue light of the screen illuminated his face as he reviewed the digital termination of his daughter's legacy. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. There was no hesitation. Decades of lineage were erased with the clinical precision of a corporate merger. Eleanor remained by the glass. With that silent digital signature, she was officially stripped of her name's weight. She was now an outsider. A junior executive, eager to display his alignment with the new power structure, offered a subtle, patronizing smirk as he walked past her. Eleanor registered the disrespect, but her reaction was a masterclass in emotional suppression. She gave him absolute, chilling nothingness. Meanwhile, Patricia stood in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on a different screen. The after-hours trading data for Sterling Corporation was displaying unusual volatility. Richard's blind spot was absolute. He was entirely focused on amputating his own family, completely oblivious to the massive hemorrhage in his corporate arteries. The atmospheric pressure in the penthouse continued to drop. The room was an engineered vacuum, desperately waiting for a spark to ignite. Richard re-emerged from the alcove. His posture was visibly lighter, the burden of a disobedient heir officially removed from his ledger. He casually informed a select circle of board members that the line of succession had been permanently and decisively restructured. The board members absorbed this information with grim nods. In their insulated reality, children were assets. If an asset failed, it was simply written off. The information propagated rapidly through the ballroom. The invisible barrier around Eleanor expanded, transforming into a stark, undeniable quarantine zone. Patricia approached Eleanor for a second time, gracefully holding two fresh flutes of champagne, playing the role of the sympathetic survivor. She offered the glass, her voice dripping with manufactured pity, quietly suggesting that it would be strategically wise for Eleanor to leave before the humiliation deepened. Eleanor did not accept the glass. She looked at Patricia with a gaze so intensely clear it seemed to pierce right through the older woman's flawless facade. Eleanor stated, with quiet absolute certainty, that the evening was far from its conclusion, and leaving now would be a profound miscalculation. A microscopic flicker of uncertainty crossed Patricia's eyes. It was the first time her perfectly orchestrated coup had encountered a psychological glitch. Observing from the bar, Douglas swirled the amber liquid in his glass. His instincts told him the invisible currents beneath the floorboards were violently shifting. The ballroom settled into a new equilibrium. Eleanor was no longer the heir apparent, she had been successfully reclassified as a cautionary tale. Richard stood at the epicenter of the room, radiating the unassailable confidence of a monarch who had decisively crushed a rebellion. The elite guests aggressively competed for his attention. In this ecosystem, proximity to Richard Sterling was the only currency that retained value. Eleanor observed the display from her perimeter. She clearly saw the machinery at work, the hollow, deeply transactional nature of every laugh and handshake. The female guest, formerly a close acquaintance, briefly made eye contact with Eleanor before quickly turning away, performing a calculated social erasure. Eleanor did not lower her gaze. She stood with the quiet, devastating dignity of someone who had already dismantled the golden cage from the inside. Over by the terrace, Douglas checked his silver watch. Decades in development gave him an innate sense for when a structure was about to collapse. Patricia discreetly monitored her device. The financial thresholds required for the hostile acquisition were rapidly approaching critical mass. Richard raised his crystal fruit in an impromptu toast, publicly celebrating the enduring strength and uncompromising foundation of his empire. 300 guests raised their glasses in synchronized obedience. The collective chime echoed through the penthouse like a finalized verdict. The toast concluded. The champagne was consumed, permanently sealing the new social contract of the evening. Richard allowed himself a rare moment of genuine satisfaction. To his eyes, the structural integrity of his empire remained utterly flawless. However, beneath the meticulously curated layer of classical music and polite laughter, a digital tremor began to ripple through the room. An investor near the bar felt his phone vibrate. He checked the screen, and his practiced, polite smile instantly evaporated into cold panic. A few feet away, another executive received a similar urgent notification. A single bead of sweat formed on his temple despite the chilled air. The hostile takeover was no longer confined to Patricia's encrypted device, it was violently breaking into the broader market reality. Eleanor noticed the subtle, erratic shifts in posture across the room. The apex predators were slowly realizing they had become the prey. Richard, entirely consumed by his own carefully constructed narrative, fatally misread the shifting atmosphere as lingering awe for his ruthless leadership. Douglas caught Eleanor's eye across the room. A brief, silent glance of acknowledgement passed between the only two people interpreting the data correctly. The massive mahogany double doors seemed to grow heavier, standing as the fragile final barrier between the fading illusion and the approaching reckoning. The contagion of panic was silent but exponential. Within minutes, a dozen separate glowing screens delivered the exact same catastrophic data. A cluster of senior board members abruptly excused themselves, moving toward the terrace with a frantic speed that bordered on undignified. The ambient symphony of the room shifted. The elegant clinking of crystal was violently replaced by the muffled, desperate tapping of touchscreens. Richard paused mid-sentence. He noticed the sudden vacuum of attention, the eyes of his audience darting nervously toward their devices. He frowned, a sharp micro-expression of irritation breaking his facade. He demanded to know what anomaly could possibly disrupt the Sterling consensus. His lead counsel, the same man who had confidently drafted Eleanor's disinheritance minutes prior, approached him with a face entirely drained of blood. The lawyer handed Richard the secured tablet. It was no longer displaying legal documents, it was displaying an unprecedented financial bloodbath. Patricia watched the exchange from the center of the room, her emerald dress catching the light as she savored the precise moment of execution. Eleanor didn't need to see the digital metrics. She read the total systemic collapse in the suddenly crumbling posture of the men who had just condemned her. The golden cage was rapidly fracturing, but the true architect of its destruction, the man Richard had labeled a failed asset, was still a phantom in the corridors. For the first time in 3 decades, Richard Sterling's cognitive machinery stalled. The red numbers on the tablet were not a dip, they were an avalanche. His console murmured the diagnosis: synchronized, multi-front hostile acquisition. The company's defenses had been bypassed from the inside. Richard slowly raised his eyes from the screen. The ecosystem that had worshipped him 10 minutes ago was now violently fracturing. The board members who had nodded in obedient synchrony were now barking frantic liquidation orders into their phones, completely abandoning their loyalty. Through the chaos, Patricia moved with the unhurried grace of a victor. The facade of the concerned friend was entirely discarded. She met Richard's horrified gaze across the floor. Her cold, triumphant smile confirmed her role as the internal architect of the boardroom coup. The physical transformation of Richard was microscopic but profound. The invisible aura of absolute authority drained from his posture. Eleanor observed her father's unraveling. She offered no comfort, standing as a silent witness to the consequences of his arrogance. Douglas, however, continued to analyze the variables. He looked at Patricia and deduced that she lacked the sheer capital to execute this alone. The penthouse, designed to be a fortress of insulation, had become a transparent cage of panic, suspended 80 floors above the indifferent city. The chaotic frequency of the room was abruptly severed by the heavy, echoing thud of the mahogany doors swinging open. Ryan Vance crossed the threshold. He did not wear the posture of an exiled subordinate, he walked with the quiet certainty of an apex predator. The ambient panic instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the anomaly. He moved through the expansive room without urgency. His tailored, minimalist suit sharply contrasted with the desperate, disheveled elites around him. Richard remained frozen, the glowing tablet trembling slightly in his grip. The devastating math of the situation finally aligned in his mindestance. The architect of the hostile takeover was not an invisible corporate entity. It was the man he had spent the evening publicly dismantling. Eleanor watched her husband approach. For the first time all evening, the rigid tension in her shoulders softened by a fraction of an inch. By the bar, Douglas offered a microscopic nod of profound respect. He recognized the brutal efficiency of a perfectly executed endgame. The wealthy crowd parted for Ryan instinctively. It was not the polite deference they had shown Richard, it was the visceral yielding to superior leverage. Ryan stopped exactly where Richard had stood minutes ago. The physical distance between the two men was minimal, but the power dynamic had entirely inverted. The silence stretching between the two men was absolute. Richard opened his mouth to issue a command, but the words fractured before they formed. When Richard finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual baritone resonance. He demanded to know the logistics of the structural breach. Ryan Vance did not offer an immediate response. He let Richard's desperation hang in the chilled air, refusing to validate it. Finally, Ryan spoke. His tone was perfectly level, agreeing with Richard's earlier public assessment that he was, indeed, a man who calculated investments carefully. The surrounding elites absorbed the exchange in terrified fascination. They were witnessing the live dismantling of a financial deity. Having delivered his acknowledgement, Ryan dismissed the former monarch with a subtle turn of his head, stepping past him entirely. He crossed the final stretch of marble toward Eleanor. The invisible quarantine zone that had isolated her all evening shattered instantly. Ryan stopped before his wife. The predatory coldness in his eyes dissolved into genuine, grounded focus as he silently assessed her state. Eleanor offered a microscopic, affirming nod. The grueling endurance test of the golden cage was officially over. Left standing in the background, Richard stared at the empty space Ryan had just occupied, realizing he was no longer the focal point of his own legacy. Satisfied with Eleanor's composure, Ryan shifted his attention back to the room. He moved slowly toward the main dining table. Richard remained anchored to his spot, unable to interrupt. The illusion of his control had been entirely stripped away. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, Ryan reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He withdrew a sleek, silver data drive. It was a remarkably small object to hold the complete architecture of a multi-billion-dollar empire. He placed it onto the polished marble surface of the table. The sharp metallic click severed the heavy silence. Addressing the paralyzed board members, Ryan confirmed that the drive contained the complete, unredacted ledger of the evening's aggressive acquisition. He quietly detailed the offshore routing and the internal fragmentation, specifically highlighting the pathways engineered by their own colleagues. Across the room, Patricia's calculated composure finally shattered. She realized her hostile maneuver had merely served as the catalyst for Ryan's ultimate purchase. Douglas observed the trap closing. The outsider hadn't just survived the internal war, he had bought the battlefield. Ryan turned his gaze back to Richard. He offered no triumphant speech, only the clinical presentation of a finalized checkmate. The initial shock receded, replaced by the desperate instinct of cornered executives. A senior board member stepped forward, attempting to challenge the legality of the drive. Ryan did not raise his voice or shift his posture. He simply recited the precise, devastating amount of leveraged debt the men's division was currently hiding. The executive froze instantly, his aggressive bluster evaporating into pale, humiliating silence. Near the perimeter of the room, Patricia began a slow, calculated retreat toward the terrace doors. Ryan's voice cut through the room, stating her name with the clinical detachment of an auditor. She stopped dead in her tracks. He systematically listed the routing numbers of her concealed offshore entities, confirming that her hidden capital was already locked within his new network. Patricia's perfect posture finally collapsed. The master manipulator recognized that the exits had been sealed long before she even knew she was trapped. The remaining guests instinctively shrank back. The collective realization hit them: Ryan Vance had not come to join their circle, he had come to own it. From the bar, Douglas took a slow sip of his whiskey, quietly relishing the absolute dismantling of the room's hypocritical hierarchy. Every narrative Richard had spent the evening building was completely incinerated. The poor investment was the only man holding the deed to the building. Stripped of his leverage and his allies, Richard grasped at his final remaining asset, paternal authority. He turned to Eleanor, his voice laced with desperate manipulation, demanding she acknowledge the ruthless nature of the man she had married. Eleanor did not recoil from her husband. Instead, she closed the minuscule gap between them, aligning herself entirely with the outsider. She looked at her father, her expression devoid of the obedience he had demanded for 28 years. She corrected his fundamental misunderstanding. Ryan had not breached the sterling corporate firewalls by force. With chilling serenity, she confessed that she had personally provided him with the unrestricted administrative access required to execute the maneuver. The revelation struck Richard like physical trauma. The foundation of his reality fractured completely. A suppressed gasp echoed through the remaining elites. The perfectly curated, compliant heiress had been the fatal Trojan horse all along. Ryan briefly glanced at Eleanor, a silent, profound acknowledgement of a partnership forged in absolute trust and calculated risk. The Sterling Empire had not merely been conquered by an external predator, its gates had been willingly opened from the inside. Richard's initial paralysis gave way to a sudden, desperate surge of defensive anger. He pointed a trembling finger toward his lead counsel, clinging to the legal mechanism he had executed just minutes ago. He declared his daughter's authorization invalid, loudly reminding the room that her succession rights had already been legally terminated. Ryan did not interrupt the outburst. He simply waited for Richard's desperate echo to fade into the high ceilings. With calculated precision, Ryan raised his wrist, glancing briefly at the minimalist dial of his watch. He clarified the timeline. The hostile acquisition had reached its absolute threshold and finalized exactly 1 hour before the gala commenced. The lead counsel frantically swiped across his tablet, his face contorting in horror as the timestamp logs confirmed the timeline. Ryan delivered the final blow. When Richard had biometrically signed the disinheritance, he was restructuring an empire he no longer owned. Richard stared down at his own hand. The digital execution he had so proudly enacted was nothing more than a signature on a hollow shell. The genius of the trap was absolute. It was not merely a financial takeover, it was a flawlessly timed psychological dismantling. Survival in the upper echelon required rapid adaptation. The elite crowd collectively attempted to pivot their loyalty to the new apex predator. The very board member who had aggressively challenged Ryan minutes ago stepped forward again, this time wearing a pathetic, appeasing smile. Ryan did not grant the man the dignity of eye contact. A single, dismissive glance was enough to halt the sycophant's approach. Ryan addressed the room with absolute clinical detachment. He informed the board that their obsolete services were no longer required under the new architecture. A mass termination, executed at a black-tie gala. Even Douglas, observing from the bar, had to admire the sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness of the move. Patricia, realizing her financial ruin was absolute, attempted to salvage her physical freedom, inching toward the exit. Ryan effortlessly blocked her escape with a single sentence: the offshore logs had already been forwarded to the regulatory authorities. She collapsed into a velvet chair, her emerald gown now looking like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Stripped of everything, Richard looked up at Eleanor. His eyes silently begged for a fraction of the daughterly mercy he had spent his life stamping out. Eleanor offered him nothing. The cold, impenetrable mask she wore was the exact reflection of the father who had raised her. The corporate execution was complete. Ryan shifted his focus entirely to Eleanor, the only variable in the room he actually valued. He did not offer a victorious smile. He simply extended his arm, grounding the moment in the quiet reality of their partnership. Eleanor took his arm smoothly. Together, they formed a unified monolith against the crumbling architecture of her father's legacy. They turned toward the exit. The assembled elites, paralyzed by the shift in gravity, instinctively cleared a wide path. A hollow, trembling voice broke the silence. Richard called out, a final, pathetic attempt to demand an explanation from the void. Ryan paused his stride. He did not fully turn around, merely glancing over his shoulder with analytical detachment. His gaze drifted to the impeccably set dining table, resting specifically on the empty chair Richard had weaponized earlier in the evening. Ryan stated that he hadn't missed the dinner due to a lack of standing. He simply saw no reason to sit at a table he was currently purchasing. The absolute finality of the statement crushed the last remnants of Richard's pride. He was a guest in his own castle. Without waiting for a response, Ryan and Eleanor resumed their walk toward the towering mahogany doors, leaving the ruins behind. They crossed the threshold of the grand mahogany doors, stepping out of the engineered suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse. The marble-lined elevator corridor offered a sudden, pristine silence. The chaotic frequency of the ballroom was instantly muffled behind them. Inside the gala, the power vacuum was absolute. The city's most formidable predators were reduced to a paralyzed, leaderless collective. Two corporate compliance officers materialized beside Patricia, signaling the immediate and irreversible freezing of her personal assets. Richard, his physical strength entirely depleted, sank heavily into the nearest available seat. It was the very chair he had left empty to humiliate Ryan. Observing the poetic symmetry from the bar, Douglas finished his whiskey, raising the empty glass in a silent toast to the departed outsider. In the quiet corridor, Ryan pressed the call button. The sharp, mechanical chime echoed like the final period at the end of a long sentence. The heavy brass doors of the private express elevator slid open, offering a polished sanctuary from the carnage they had orchestrated. Stepping inside, Eleanor let out a slow, controlled exhale. The meticulously constructed mask of the obedient daughter was gone forever. The brass doors glided shut, seamlessly cutting off the view of the Sterling Empire as they began their rapid descent back to the real world. The digital counter above the brass doors plummeted steadily, tracking their rapid descent from the stratosphere of the elite. Within the insulated cabin, Ryan unbuttoned his jacket. The ruthlessly clinical architect of the hostile takeover was instantly replaced by the grounded man Eleanor loved. She looked up at him, and for the first time all evening, a genuine, unguarded smile broke through her stoic facade. He took her hand, a silent reaffirmation that the multi-billion-dollar acquisition was never about power, it was merely the price of their absolute freedom. 80 floors above, the grand exodus had begun. The wealthy guests evacuated the ballroom with the frantic efficiency of rats fleeing a compromised vessel. The once invisible waitstaff moved methodically through the room, clearing the crystal and extinguishing the illusion of the gala. Richard remained isolated at the main table as the chandelier lights were systematically powered down, plunging the perimeter of his empire into darkness. His former lead counsel approached the table one final time, placing a single, printed document onto the polished marble surface. It was the formal notice of his immediate, involuntary resignation. Richard stared at the paper, physically incapable of comprehending his own erasure. The elevator glided to a smooth halt. The doors opened, revealing the vast, quiet expanse of the ground floor lobby, entirely detached from the ruins above. They stepped out of the brass cabin and walked across the expansive marble lobby. Every footstep resonated with the absolute finality of their departure. Passing through the heavy glass revolving doors, they left the engineered climate of the Sterling Tower behind. The crisp, indifferent wind of the metropolis greeted them. It was a sharp contrast to the suffocating, perfumed air of the penthouse. Eleanor paused on the pavement, looking up at the towering monolith of glass and steel that had defined her entire existence. She felt no trace of mourning for the empire she had just helped dismantle, she felt only the profound weightlessness of a severed chain. Far above them, the humiliating extraction of Patricia was underway. She was escorted toward the freight elevator, her social capital entirely liquidated. Richard remained immobilized in the gathering dark. The ambient lights were cut, leaving him isolated in the cold shadows of his former domain. The solitary waiter quietly removed the untouched champagne glass from Richard's table, erasing the final physical evidence of his arrogant toast. On the street level, Ryan bypassed the line of waiting chauffeurs. He approached a sleek, dark, unbranded vehicle parked quietly by the curb. He opened the passenger door for Eleanor, not as a display of newly acquired dominance, but simply as a man taking his wife home. Ryan settled into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, a low, steady heartbeat replacing the chaotic noise of the evening. The sleek vehicle pulled away from the curb, seamlessly merging into the glowing arteries of the city traffic. Inside the cabin, rhythmic flashes of streetlights washed over their faces, highlighting a shared, profound tranquility. Eleanor glanced in the side mirror. The towering Sterling skyscraper was rapidly shrinking, reduced to just another building in the skyline. Ryan drove with effortless control. The predatory tension he had weaponized upstairs was completely deactivated. Eleanor reached across the console, resting her hand lightly on his arm. It was a simple, grounding confirmation of their victory. High above the city, the heavy penthouse doors were finally locked. The empire had been quietly packed away into darkness. Down on a quiet avenue, Douglas walked alone, pulling his collar up against the cold, satisfied with the evening's poetic justice. The dark car crossed a massive suspension bridge. The dark water below mirrored the bright, shifting lights of the metropolis. They drove forward into the endless night. The golden cage was destroyed, leaving them with the absolute vastness of a clean slate. The night dissolved into the pale, indifferent light of dawn. The metropolis woke to a fundamentally altered financial landscape. Headlines across digital networks flashed the same unprecedented news: the overnight liquidation of the sterling corporate dynasty. Miles away from the city's frantic awakening, the sleek dark vehicle sat parked outside a minimalist coastal architectural retreat. Ryan stood on the expansive wooden deck. The ocean breeze was sharp, but the suffocating corporate pressure was entirely gone. He watched the horizon, holding a simple Ceramis coffee mug. He was no longer the apex predator of the boardroom. The war was over. Eleanor emerged onto the deck. She wore a simple, oversized cashmere sweater, entirely discarding the heavy, restrictive armor of her evening gown. She joined him at the railing. There were no cameras, no judgmental elites, and no engineered expectations to fulfill. Ryan handed her the warm mug. The gesture was small, but it carried the profound weight of their hard-won autonomy. Back in the city, the sun struck the glass facade of the Sterling Tower. It stood as a hollow monument to a deposed king. Inside the darkened penthouse, Richard sat exactly where he had been left. The morning light offered no comfort, only the stark illumination of his ruin. By mid-morning, the Sterling name was already being systematically removed from the physical architecture of the financial district. The massive metallic letters that once projected absolute dominance were unceremoniously lowered onto the pavement by indifferent workers. Inside the former Sterling headquarters, the mahogany boardroom sat entirely vacant. The seats of power had been permanently vacated. Douglas walked through the empty corridors. As the newly appointed transitional custodian, he ensured the peaceful transfer of the Ampius bonds. Far below, Richard Sterling exited his building for the last time. There was no private vehicle waiting for him at the curb. Stripped of his limitless capital, he was forced to merge into the ordinary pedestrian traffic he had spent his life hovering above. He walked as an anonymous, broken man, his bespoke navy suit looking strangely out of place on the unforgiving concrete. Miles away, the coastal retreat offered a profound counter-narrative to the city's concrete decay. Ryan sat at a bare wooden table, reviewing a single, simple contract. It was not a merger, but the deed to a quiet sanctuary. Eleanor stood behind him, resting her hand on his shoulder. The empire was gone, and they had successfully salvaged the only asset that mattered. At exactly 9 in the morning, the financial markets opened. The Sterling corporate ticker symbol blinked once on the global exchange boards before being permanently delisted. Inside the quiet boardroom, Douglas formalized the transition. He signed the final transfer documents, officially archiving a 3-decade dynasty into corporate history. Richard rested on a cold concrete bench in a public plaza. Surrounded by the relentless pace of the metropolis, the former titan was rendered entirely invisible. A discarded financial newspaper tumbled across the pavement, driven by the city wind. Its front page displayed Richard's image beneath a headline declaring absolute ruin. Far removed from the urban decay, Ryan walked along the edge of the shoreline. The rhythmic crash of the ocean replaced the engineered hum of servo rooms. Eleanor walked beside him in the damp sand. Stripped of the heavy expectations of her lineage, she moved with a lightness she had never previously known. They halted at the water's edge, gazing out at the unbroken horizon. There were no hidden agendas here, only the vast, indifferent beauty of the natural world. In a sterile downtown legal office, Patricia aggressively disputed her frozen accounts. Stripped of her emerald elegance, she wore a drab suit, fighting a losing battle. The narrative drifted up the sheer glass face of the former Sterling Tower. The space where the name had projected dominance was now just blank, reflective emptiness. Ryan bent down, selecting a smooth, flat stone from the beach. He skipped it across the water, a simple, uncalculated gesture of a man who finally owned his time. Inside the sunlit coastal retreat, Eleanor held her sleek smartphone. It was the final physical tether to her former existence. The screen pulsed with dozens of missed communications. Former elites, now desperate, were attempting to leverage her for corporate survival. With absolute calm, she dropped the device into the waste bin. The digital tether was permanently severed without a second thought. In the open kitchen, Ryan prepared a simple morning meal. The man who had acquired an empire was entirely focused on domestic tranquility. He carried 2 fresh ceramic mugs to the wooden deck. The silence between them was not a void, but a profound structural foundation. Miles away, the metropolis had already moved on. A massive industrial tarp was raised over the Sterling Tower, preparing for a new corporate entity. Richard navigated the cramped confines of a temporary, leased apartment. The sprawling penthouse had been replaced by suffocating, low-ceilinged reality. He packed a single cardboard box with his remaining personal effects. The bespoke navy suit he wore was heavily creased, mirroring his internal collapse. The narrative shifted away from the concrete decay, returning to the vast, unfiltered expanse of the ocean horizon. Ryan and Eleanor walked along the shoreline. They had traded a golden cage for the immeasurable wealth of absolute, unmonitored freedom. The morning sun fully crested the ocean horizon, casting a warm, unfiltered light over the dawn of a new era. Eleanor looked at Ryan. Her posture was entirely devoid of the aristocratic tension she had been forced to carry for 28 years. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. It was a simple, grounding gesture of protective partnership, forged in the crucible of their shared victory. Back in the indifferent metropolis, Richard carried a single cardboard box out of his cramped building, instantly swallowed by the anonymous pedestrian tide. In a sterile, fluorescent-lit room, Patricia aggressively signed a plea agreement. Her vast network of influence had been permanently deactivated. Standing at the base of the former Sterling Tower, Douglas watched the new corporate logo being hoisted up, signaling the relentless, unsentimental march of the financial machine. The narrative returned to the coastal retreat. A pair of untouched Ceramis coffee mugs sat on the wooden railing, forgotten in the profound tranquility of the morning. Ryan and Eleanor walked further down the shoreline, their figures becoming smaller against the vast, beautiful, and completely indifferent landscape. They had successfully traded the suffocating weight of a golden cage for the infinite horizon of absolute, unmonitored freedom. The story concluded not with a roar of corporate victory, but with the quiet, enduring silence of total liberation.